Lyddie by Katherine Paterson, Chapter 19, Diana. She had been alone before Rachel came, but she had not known what loneliness was, this sharp pain in her breastbone dragging down into a dull, persistent heaviness. My heart is heavy, she thought. It's not just a saying. It is what is. Heavy, a great stone lodged in my breast, pressing down my whole being. How can I even stand straight and look out upon the world? I am doubled over into myself, and for all the weight, find only emptiness. Workdays dragged by with nothing to look forward to at the evening bell. Rumor had it that the corporation had slowed the clocks to squeeze even more minutes out of the long summer shift. From time to time she wondered why she was working so hard, now that the farm was sold and Rachel and Charlie lost to her. She brushed the question aside. She worked hard because work was all she knew, all she had. Everything else that had made her know herself as Lyddie Worthen was gone. Nothing but hard work, so hard that her mind became as callous as her hands. Work alone remained. She fell into bed exhausted and only felt the full burden of her grief and dreams, which, determined as she was, she could not control. The weavers at the Massachusetts Corporation had all refused the agent's demand that they each tend 4 looms and take a piece rate reduction as well. They signed a pledge in defiance and none of them backed down. The word went like a whispered wave through the conquered weaving room. Not a girl has backed down, not a one. Diana should have been elated. Wasn't it a victory for the association? But when Lyddie was finally able to rouse herself from her own pain, she saw that Diana's face was drawn, the expression grim and set. Since Rachel had gone, whenever Bridget or Diana had tried to reach out to her, she had shaken them off. No one could understand her loss, she was sure. She did not have the strength to bear their vain attempts to comfort. Then, suddenly, it was mid-July, and Lyddie realized that Diana was still at work, looking more sickly by the day. It was more than the heat of the weaving room. She's worried, Lyddie thought. She's sore troubled, and I, so bent on my own trial, never took it to mind. Lyddie tried to speak to Diana on the stairs, but she seemed hardly to hear the greeting. Are they threatening her with dismissal? With blacklisting? A chill went through Lyddie. She thought she had nothing else to lose, but suppose Diana was to go. Diana, the one person who from her first day on had treated her like a proper person, the only one who had never laughed at Lyddie's queer mountain speech or demanded that she change her manners or her mind. All the girls took their burdens to Diana. She was always the one who came to help you. Nobody ever thought of Diana needing help. She's ill, like Betsy and Rachel and Prudence and a host of others, Lyddie thought. She's worked here too long and too hard. How much longer could Diana last? How much longer could any of them last? I must do something for her, Lyddie decided. Give her a present. There was only one present good enough. Diana? Lyddie worked her way through the jostling crowd of operatives crossing the yard. I've been thinking. She glanced around to see if anyone was listening, but all the girls were too intent on rushing home for their suppers. About Even now that she had made up her mind, she couldn't quite bring herself to speak the forbidden word in the very courtyard of the corporation. She took a deep breath. I've been thinking on signing. The older girl turned to her and put her hand on Lyddie's sleeve. Well, she said, and Lyddie couldn't quite make out the rest in the clamor of the yard, but it sounded something like, well, we'll see, as Diana let herself be carried away in the rushing stream of operatives. But I mean it, thought Lyddie. I mean it. Earlier in the spring she had known that there were girls in her own house secretly circulating the petition, but now that she had made up her mind to it, she wanted to do it for Diana. How could it be a true present otherwise? After supper she put on her bonnet and went to Diana's boarding house. She asked one of the girls in the front room of number 3 for Diana. Diana Goss? The girl asked with a sneer. It's Tuesday. She'll be at her meeting. Oh. The girl looked her up and down as though memorizing her features. Maybe the girl was a corporation spy. Stare her down, Lyddie told herself. The other was shorter than she, so when Lyddie stood tall and looked down into her eyes, the girl shifted her gaze. It's at their reading room on Central Street. She glanced back at Lyddie. The sneer had returned. Number 76. All are welcome, so I'm told. In for a penny, in for a pound, thought Lyddie, and made her way into town. The meeting had already begun. Someone was reading minutes. The 40 or so girls crowded into the small room looked almost like a sewing circle, so many of the girls were doing mending or needlework. Hello, the young woman who seemed to be in charge interrupted the secretary's droning. Come on in. Lyddie stepped into the room, looked about uncertainly for a chair. To her relief, she saw Diana getting up and coming toward her. You came, she said, her tired features relaxing into a smile. It reminded her of that first night when she had gone to see Diana, except then Diana had looked lovely and full of life. She took Lyddie to a place where there were 2 vacant chairs and sat beside her while the meeting carried on. It was hard for Lyddie to follow the discussion. They were planning something for some sort of rally at the end of the month. She kept waiting for someone to mention the petition so she could declare herself ready to sign, but no one did. At the first curfew bell, the woman in charge pronounced the meeting adjourned until the following Tuesday, and the girls broke into a buzz, gathering their sewing things together and putting on bonnets to leave. The woman who had been in charge came over to where Lyddie was standing with Diana. She stretched out her hand. "I'm Mary Emerson," she said. "Welcome. I think this is your first time with us." Lyddie shook the woman's hand and nodded. "This is my friend Lydia Worthen," Diana said. "She's thinking about joining us." Miss Emerson turned expectantly to Lyddie. "I come to sign the petition," Lyddie said. The woman cocked her head, seemingly puzzled. What was the matter with her? The one to ask for 10-hour workdays? Why was she explaining the petition to a leader of the movement? It was crazy. "Maybe next year," Diana was saying quietly. "No, I made up my mind to it. I want to do it now, tonight." "But we've already submitted it," Miss Emerson said. "We had to, before the legislature recessed for the year." She had at long last made up her mind to do it, and now it was too late? "But next year," Diana repeated. "You can put your name in the very first column if you like." "Yes," said Miss Emerson brightly. "That's our motto. We'll try again. Since 4,000 names didn't convince them, next year we'll have to get 8. She gave Lyddie the kind of encouraging smile a teacher gives to a slow pupil. "We'll need all the help we can get." Lyddie stood there, open-mouthed, looking from Diana's thin face to the other woman's robust one. Too late. She'd come too late. She was always too late. Too late to save the farm. Too late to keep her family together. Too late to do for Diana the only thing she knew to do. "We'd better get you back to number 5, Diana was saying, like she was some helpless child who needed tending. "You wouldn't want to be late." They hurried down the dimly lit streets toward the conquered boarding houses without speaking. Lyddie wanted to explain, to say she was sorry, to somehow make it up to Diana, but she didn't know how to do it. As they neared number 5, Diana broke the silence. "Thank you for coming tonight." "Oh, Diana, I come too late. You came as soon as you could. I'm always too late to do any good." "Lyddie," Diana was hesitating. "I'll miss you." What was she saying? "I ain't going nowhere. I'll be right here next year and the next—" "No, I'm the one who will be leaving." "But where would you be going?" Diana had always said that the mill was her family. "Boston, I think. I don't understand. Are you ailing?" "Lyddie, if I don't leave soon, right away in fact, I'll be dismissed." "It's because of the cussed petition. They're trying to get you." "No, not that. I wish it were." They had stopped walking and stood several yards away from the steps of number 5. They both watched the heavy door swing open and glimpsed the light inside as 2 girls hurried in to beat the final bell. "It's because—" "Oh, Lyddie, don't despise me. I could never do that. How could Diana say such a thing?" "Lyddie, I've been, I don't know, foolish, wicked." "What are you talking about? You could never be—" "Oh, yes." She was silent for a moment as though sifting the words she needed from the chaff of her thoughts. "I'm going to have a child, Lyddie." "A what?" Her voice had dropped to a stunned whisper. She tried to search Diana's features, but it was too dark to read her expression. "Who done this to you?" she asked finally. "Oh, Lyddie, no one done it to me." "Then he'll marry you, eh?" He's not free to marry. There's a wife, in Concord. She wouldn't come to live here in a factory town, though her father is one of the owners." Diana's laugh was short and harsh. "It was that doctor." Lyddie was sure of it. "He looked so kind and gentle, and all the time—" "But what will you do?" She could hear now the shrillness in her voice. She tried to tone it down. "Where can you go?" "I've got some savings, and he's determined to help as he can. I'll find work. We'll manage, the baby and I. It ain't right. I'll need to go soon. I can't bring dishonor on the association. Any whisper of this, and our enemies will dance like dervishes with delight." She could hear the grim amusement in Diana's voice. "I won't hand them a weapon to destroy us, not if I can possibly help it." "How can I help you? Oh, Diana, I've been so blind." She touched Lyddie's cheek lightly. "Let's just pray everyone has been as blind. I'll write you if I may. Tell you how things go. You've been so good to me. I'll miss you, little Lyddie." The final bell began to clang. "Quick, slip in before they lock you out." "Diana," but the older girl pushed her toward the door and hurried away down the street toward number 3. The word passed around the floor next morning was that Diana Goss had left, snatching an honorable dismissal while she could still get it. Much more of her radical doings, and she would have been blacklisted, or so the rumors went. Chapter 20. B is for Bridget. Bridget had 2 looms now and would soon be ready for a third. She stood between them proudly, the sweat pouring from her forehead in concentration. If she would wear less clothing. But no, the girls from the acre wore the same layers of dress, summer and winter. Still, despite her craziness, Bridget was turning into a proper operative. Mr. Marsden hardly came past Lyddie's looms these days. When their eyes met by chance, it was as though they had never been introduced. Earlier, his coldness had worried her. She feared then that he might find some reason to dismiss her, so she had been scrupulous to observe every regulation to the letter. As the days went on, she became less anxious about Mr. Marsden's state of mind, much preferring his coolness to the rosebud smiles and little pats she had endured before her illness. She treated herself to some more books. In honor of Ezekiel Freeman, what a handsome name her friend had chosen for himself, she bought Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, and a Bible. Both volumes became a quiet comfort to her Sunday loneliness, because as she read them she could hear Ezekiel's rich, warm voice filling the darkness of the cabin. She had liked Mr. Dickens' account of his travels in America, all but the Lowell part. It was, as Diana had warned her, romantical. There was no mention in its rosy descriptions of sick lungs or blacklisting or men with wives it conquered. July wore on its weary way into August. It seemed a century since the summer just a year ago when she had read and reread Oliver Twist and dreamed of home. She had been such a child then, such a foolish, unknowing child. As always, many of the New England operatives had gone home. Bridget took on her third loom. More Irish girls came on as spare hands. Some of the machines simply stood idle. The room was quieter. Lyddie took to copying out passages from Mr. Douglass and the Bible to paste on her looms. She liked the Psalms best. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, and by the rivers of Babylon there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. The Psalms were poetry, no songs, that rode the powerful rhythm of the looms. Sometimes she composed her own. By the rivers of Merrimack and Concord, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered. I must forget, she thought. I must forget them all. I cannot bear the remembering. Lyddie was strong again. Her body no longer betrayed her into exhaustion by the end of the day, and she was past shedding tears for what might have been. It was a relief, she told herself, not to carry the burden of debt, or what was worse, the welfare of other persons. A great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders, had it not, and some day the stone would be taken from her breast as well. Between them, she and Bridget coached several of the new spare hands, all of them wearing far too much clothing in the suffocating heat. But me mither says me capes will kape me cool, one of the girls insisted. Lyddie let it be. She hadn't managed to persuade Bridget to take off her silly capes. How could she expect to persuade the new girls? Still, she was more patient with them than she had ever been with poor Bridget at the beginning. She had to be. Bridget herself was a paragon of gentleness, teaching the new girls all that Lyddie and Diana had taught her, never raising her voice in irritation or complaint. Lyddie watched her snip off a length of thread from a bobbin and lead one of the clumsier girls over to the window and show her in the best light how to tie a weaver's knot. It was exactly what Lyddie remembered doing, but she knew to her shame that her own face had betrayed exasperation, while Bridget's was as gentle as that of a ewe nuzzling her lamb. She smiled ruefully at Bridget as the girl returned to her own looms. Bridget smiled back broadly. She's a bit slow, that one. We're all allowed to be fools the first week or two, she said, hearing Diana's voice in her head. There had been a short note from Diana telling her not to worry, that she had found a place in a seamstress's shop, but how could she not be anxious for her? Bridget was continuing sadly, but I'm a fool yet. She nodded at the psalm pasted on Lyddie's loom. And you such a scholar. Lyddie slid her fingers under the paper to loosen the paste and handed it to Bridget. Here, she said, for practice. I'll make another for myself. Bridget shook her head. It will do me no good. I might as well be blind, you know. But I sent you a note once. I took it straight away to Diana to read to me. You've learned your letters at least? Shamefaced, the girl shook her head. Lyddie sighed. She couldn't take Bridget on to teach, but how could she begrudge her a chance to start? She made papers for the girl to post. A is for agent. Beside it was a crude picture of a man in a beaver hat, the stern high priest of those invisible Boston gods who had created the corporations and to whom all in Lowell daily sacrificed their lives. B is for Bobbin and Bridget too. B was instantly mastered. C is for carding. D is for drawing in. She went on, using as far as possible words Bridget knew from factory life. Each day Lyddie gave her 3 new papers to post and learn, and at the end of the day to take home and practice. So it was that day by day, without intending to be, Lyddie found herself bound letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence, page by page, until it was, come by when you've had your supper and we'll work on the reader together. Or on a Sunday afternoon, meet me by the river and I'll bring paper and pens for practice. She did not go to Bridget's house. She was not afraid to go into the acre. She was not frightened by rumors of robberies and assaults, but somehow she was reluctant to go for Bridget's sake. She did not want Bridget to have to be ashamed of the only home she had. At last a letter came from Charlie. She had not allowed herself to look for one, but when it came she realized how she had longed to hear, just to be reminded that she had not been altogether forgotten. Dear Sister Lyddie, Charlie did make his letters well. "We are fine. We hope you are well, too. Rachel began school last month. Her cough is nearly gone, and she's growing quite fat with Miss Finney's cooking. Luke Stevens says he has had no reply. Do think kindly on him, Lyddie. You need someone to watch out for you as well. Your loving brother, Charles Worthen." She almost tore this letter up, but stopped at the first tear. She had nearly ripped the page across Charlie's name. September came. Some of the New England girls had returned to the weaving room, though the room now was mostly Irish. No Diana, of course, though there was something in Lyddie that kept waiting for her, that kept expecting to see the tall, quiet form moving toward her through the lint-filled room. She had taken something from the weaving floor with her going. There was no quiet center left in the tumult. A letter arrived in September on thick, expensive paper, the address decked out in curlicues. "We regret to inform you of the death of Maggie M. Worthen." They hadn't even got her name right. Poor Mama. Nothing ever right for her in life or death. Lyddie squeezed her eyes closed and tried to picture her mother's face. She could see the thin, restless form rocking back and forth before the fire, the hair already streaked with gray, but the face was blurred. She had been gone so long from them, gone long before she died. Fall came, not the raucous patchwork of the Green Mountains, but the sedate brocade of a Massachusetts city. The days began to shorten. Lyddie went to work in darkness and came back to supper in darkness. The whale oil lamps stayed on nearly the whole day in the factory, so water buckets were kept filled on every floor. Fire was a constant dread while the lamps burned. As the days grew short, breakfast came before the working day began. There was, as always, barely time to swallow the meals, though the food was not as ample as it had been a year ago. At the end of the day now, she waited for Bridget, and they would go out together. Often all the other girls passed them on the stairs or in the yard, for they would be talking about what Bridget had read since the day before, and Lyddie would solve the mystery of an impossible word or the conundrum of a sentence. Then one evening she realized that Bridget was not beside her on the crowded stairs. She tried to wait, but the crowd of chattering operatives pushed her forward. She went down to the bottom of the stairs and stepped out of the stream. 100 or more girls went past. She was puzzled. Surely Bridget had been right beside her. They had been talking. Bridget had asked her what thraldom was. She was trying laboriously to read Mr. Douglas's book, but was yet to get through the first page of the preface. At last the stairs were empty of clattering feet and the shrill laughter of young women at the end of a long workday, but still there was no Bridget. Lyddie hesitated. Perhaps the girl had gone ahead, or perhaps she had forgotten something and gone back. Lyddie started across the nearly deserted yard. Her supper would be waiting, and Miss Bedloe was insulted by tardiness. She had got nearly to the gate when something made her stop, nose up, like a doe with young in the thicket. She hurried back and climbed the 4 flights to the weaving room. The lamps had been extinguished by the operatives as they left their looms, so at first her eyes could make out nothing but the hulking shapes of the machines. Then she heard a strained, high-pitched voice, "Please, sir. Please, Mr. Marsden." Lyddie snatched up the fire bucket. It was full of water, but she didn't notice the weight. "Please, no." She ran down the aisle between the looms toward the voice and saw in the shadows Bridget, eyes white with fear, and Mr. Marsden's back. His hands were clamped on Bridget's arms. "Mr. Marsden!" At the sound of her hoarse cry, the overseer whirled about. She crammed the fire bucket down over his shiny pate, his bulging eyes, his rosebud mouth fixed in a perfect little O. The stagnant water sloshed over his shoulders and ran down his trousers. She let go of the bucket and grabbed Bridget's hand. They began to run, Lyddie dragging Bridget across the floor. Behind in the darkness she thought she heard the noise of an angry bear crashing an oatmeal pot against the furniture. She started to laugh. By the time they were at the bottom of the stairs she was weak with laughter and her side ached, but she kept running, through the empty yard, past the startled gatekeeper, across the bridge, and down the row of wide-eyed boarding houses, dragging a bewildered Bridget behind her. Chapter 21. Turpitude. By morning the laughter was long past. She was awake and dressed, pacing the narrow corridor between the beds before the 4:30 bell. Her breath caught high in her throat, and her blood raced around her body, undecided whether to run fire through her veins, searing her despite the November chill, or freeze to the icy rivulet of a mountain brook. She could not touch her breakfast. The smell of fried codfish turned her stomach, but she sat there amidst the chatter and clatter of the meal because it was easier to pass the time in the noise of company than in the raging silence of her room. She was the first at the gate. It wasn't that she was eager for the day to begin, but eager for it to be over, for whatever was to happen, and she did not doubt that something dreadful must happen, for whatever must happen to be in the past. She tried not to think of Bridget. She could not take on Bridget's fate as well as her own. If only she had not come back up the stairs. Monster! Would I have wished to leave that poor child alone? Better to feed Rachel and Agnes to the bear, and yet Bridget was not a helpless child. She might have broken loose, stomped his foot, or Well, it was too late for that. Lyddie had gone back. She had, mercy on her, picked up that pail of filthy water and crammed it down on the overseer's neat little head, and all she had need to do was speak. When she had called his name, he had turned and let Bridget go. But no, Lyddie could not be satisfied. She had taken that pail and rammed it till the man's shoulders were almost squeezed up under the tim. The skin on her scalp crawled. Why didn't they open the gate? She was as weary of the scene in her head as if she'd actually picked up that heavy bucket and brought it down over and over again and run the length of the yard, dragging Bridget behind her 1,000 times over, laughing. Of course he must have heard her. She had howled like a maniac. He must have heard. The other operatives were crowded about, jostling her as they all waited for the bell, and still, when it rang, she jumped. It was so loud, so like an alarm clanging danger. She tried to turn against the tide, to get away while there was still time, but she was caught in the chattering, laughing trap of factory girls pushing themselves forward into the new day. She gave up and allowed the press of bodies around her to propel her to the enclosed staircase and up the 4 flights to the weaving room. Bridget was not at her looms. Mr. Marsden was not on his high stool. Her execution was delayed. She felt relief, which was immediately swallowed up in anxiety. She needed it all to be over. One of the girls from the acre approached her. "Bridget says to tell you she's feeling a wee bit poorly this morning. You are not to worry." The little coward. She's going to let me face it all alone, eh? When I was the one risked all to help her. The girl glanced back over her shoulder and around the room. She bent her face close to Lyddie's neck and whispered, "The truth be told, she got word not to report this morning, but she had no wish to alarm you." Now Lyddie was truly alarmed, without even the slight armor that resentment might provide. Would they, then, be punishing Bridget instead of her? What sin had Bridget committed? What rule had she ever trespassed? And she with a sickly mother and nearly a dozen brothers and sisters to care for. Mr. Marsden had come in. Lyddie kept her eyes carefully on her looms. The room shook and shuddered into life. Lyddie and the Irish girl beyond kept Bridget's looms going between them as best they could. She was almost busy enough to suppress her fears, and then a young man, the agent's clerk in his neat suit and cravat, appeared at her side and asked her to come with him to the agent's office. The time had come at last. She shut down her own looms and one of Bridget's, and followed the clerk down the stairs and out across the yard to the low building that housed the counting room and the offices. The agent Graves was seated at his huge roll-top desk and did not at once turn from his papers and acknowledge her presence. The clerk had only taken her as far as the door, so she stood just inside as he closed it behind her. She tried to breathe. She waited like that, hardly able to get a breath past her Adam's apple, until she began to feel quite faint. Would she collapse then in a heap on the rug? She studied the pattern, shapes of dull brown, starting nearly black in the center and spinning out lighter and lighter to a dirty yellow at the outer edge. Dizzy, she stumbled a step forward to keep from falling. The man turned in his chair as though annoyed. He was wearing half spectacles, and he lowered his massive head and stared over them at her. You sent for me, sir?" It came out like a hen cackle. "Yes, you sent for me, sir." She was glad to hear her voice grow stronger. The man kept staring as though she were a maggot on his dish. "Lydia Worthen, sir, you sent for me?" "Ah, yes, Miss Worthen." He neither stood nor asked her to sit down. Miss Worthen. He gathered the papers he had been working on and tamped the bottom of the pile on his desk to neaten it, and then laid the stack down on the right side of the desk. Then he scraped his chair around to face her more directly. "Miss Worthen, I've had a distressing interview with your overseer this morning." She couldn't help but wonder how Mr. Marsden had retold last night's encounter. "It seems," he continued, "it seems you are a troublemaker in the weaving room." He was studying her closely now, as closely as he had studied his papers before. "A troublemaker," he repeated. "I, sir?" "Yes. Mr. Marsden fears you are having a bad influence on the other girls there." So there had been no report of last night. That, at least, seemed clear. "I do my work, sir," Lyddie said, gathering courage. "I have no intention of causing trouble on the floor." "How long have you been with us, Miss Worthen?" "A year, sir. Last April, sir." "And how many looms are you tending at this time?" "4, sir." "I see. And your wages, on the average?" "I make a good wage, sir. Lately it's been $3 above my board." "Are you satisfied with these wages, then?" "Yes, sir." "I see. And the hours?" "I'm used to long hours. I manage." "I see. And none of this," he waved a massive hand, "none of this 10-hour business, eh?" "I never signed a petition. I meant to, but no need for you to know it." There was a long pause, during which the agent took off his spectacles as though to see her better. "So," he said finally, "you are not one of these female reform girls?" "No, sir." "I see," he said, replacing his spectacles and looking quite as though he saw much less than he had a few minutes before. "I see." She took a tiny step forward. "May I ask, sir, why I am being called a troublemaker?" She spoke very softly, but the agent heard her. "Yes, well, maybe," her heart thumped in admiration for her own boldness, "maybe Mr. Marsden could be called, sir? How is it exactly that I have displeased him?" Her voice went up to soften the request into a question. Yes, well, he hesitated. Open the door. And when Lyddie obeyed, he called to the clerk to summon Mr. Marsden, then turned again to Lyddie. You may sit down, Miss Wortham, he said, and went back to the papers on his desk. Though the chair he indicated was narrow and straight, she was grateful to sit down at last. The spurt of courage had exhausted her as much as her fear had earlier. She was glad, too, to have time to pull her rioting thoughts together, but the longer she waited, the greater the tumult inside her, so that when the clerk opened the door and Mr. Marsden appeared, she could only just keep from jumping up and crying out. She pressed her back into the spindles of the chair until she could almost feel the print of the wood through to her chest. She kept her eyes on the dizzying oval spiral of the rug. There was a clearing of the throat, and then, "You sent for me, sir?" Lyddie nearly laughed aloud. Her exact words, not 10 minutes before. The superintendent turned in his chair, but again he did not stand or offer the visitor a chair. Miss Wortham here asked to know the charges against her. Mr. Marsden coughed. Lyddie looked up despite herself. At her glance the overseer blinked quickly, then composed himself, his lids hooding his little dark eyes, his rosebud mouth tightening to a slit. "This one is a troublemaker," he said evenly. She leapt to her feet. She couldn't seem to stop herself. "A troublemaker? Then what be you, Mr. Marsden? What be you, eh?" The agent's head went up. His body was spread, and his eyes bulged like a great toad poised to spring. "Sit down, Miss Wortham." She sank onto the chair. Her outburst had given the overseer the time he needed. He smiled slightly as though to say, "See, no lady, this one." Satisfied that he had stilled her, the agent shifted his gaze from Lyddie to her accuser. "A troublemaker, Mr. Marsden?" For a quick moment Lyddie hoped, but the man went on. "In what way a troublemaker? Her work record seems satisfactory." "It is not." And now Mr. Marsden turned and glared straight at Lyddie, all trace of nervousness gone. "It is not her work as such, indeed." And here he gave a sad little laugh. "I at one time thought of her as one of the best on the floor. But," he turned back to the agent, his voice solemn and quiet, "I am forced, sir, to ask for her dismissal. It is a matter of moral turpitude." Moral what? What was he saying? What was he accusing her of? "I see," said the agent, as though all had been explained when nothing had. "I cannot," and now the overseer's voice was fairly dripping with the honey of regret. "For the sake of all the innocent young women in my care, I cannot have among my girls someone who sets an example of moral turpitude." "Certainly not, Mr. Marsden. The corporation cannot countenance moral turpitude." She turned, unbelieving, from one man to the other, but they ignored her. She fought for words to counter the drift the interview had taken, but what could she say? She did not know what turpitude was. How could she deny something she did not even know existed? She knew what moral was, but that didn't help. Moral was Amelia's territory of faithful attendance at Sabbath worship and prayer meeting and Bible study, and she couldn't ask for consideration on those counts. She hardly ever went to worship, and Lord knew when she read, it wasn't just the Bible. Still, she was no worse than many, was she? At least she was not a papist, and no one was condemning them. She opened her mouth. They were both looking at her sadly but sternly. In the silence the battle had been lost. "You may ask the clerk for whatever wages are due you, Miss Wortham," the agent said, turning to his desk. Mr. Marsden gave his superior's back a nod and tight rosebud smile. Did he click his heels? At any rate, he left quickly without another glance toward Lyddie. "You may go now," the agent said without turning. What could she do? She stumbled to her feet and out the door. They paid her wages full and just, but there was no certificate of honorable discharge from the Concord Corporation, and with no certificate she would never be hired by any other corporation in Lowell. She walked out of the tall gate benumbed. She had often dreamed of this last day, but in her dream she would be going home in triumph, and now there was no triumph, and no home to go to even in disgrace.